I'm not sure which was weirder. The fact that Dad had a hole in his head, or the fact that he was just so unimpressed with it. Dad had come home from his job at the steel mill, just as he had 1,000 times. We heard him sit his hard hat down by the door as he stripped out of his jumpsuit before coming to dinner. Mom had meatloaf on the table with potatoes and peas, Dad's favorite, and we waited patiently for him to arrive like we always did. If this sounds weird to you, that's because it should. Dad had a strange idea that he should go to work, Mom should stay at home and keep the kids, and that everyone should look like an episode of Leave It to Beaver when he got home. I remember for a while, Mom met him at the door with a cold glass of beer when he came home. He eventually told her to stop so that the dust from the mill didn't get on her. It was odd, but Dad paid the bills, and that's how he liked it, so that's what we did. Mom had gotten half of her welcome home greeting out before it curdled in her throat. My brother had already seen it, but I was still looking at the TV around the corner and hadn't seen it yet. MTV was playing a song by a band I liked, and I looked up at Mom to ask if I could use the bathroom when I noticed Dad's head. Dad, meanwhile, had sat down at the table like nothing was amiss, opening his napkin and putting it on his lap. He was hungry from a day at work, and he had just started asking us about our own day when he noticed our horrified looks. "What? What's the matter?" All three of us were speechless for a moment. How did he not realize what had us all so gobsmacked? Surely he had to feel that. He had to realize what had happened to him. There was no way that a person could be so oblivious of something like that. In the center of Dad's forehead was a hole big enough to stick your pinky finger into. It wasn't like a wound. Wounds usually bleed or appear red or scabby. This one was simply a black hole in his forehead. The edges looked a little ragged, but that more reminded me of a hole that someone had drilled into the pavement than a wound. As strange as the hole was, the fact that it didn't seem to have an exit point was even stranger. "Honey," Mom asked, trying to be diplomatic about the situation, Did something happen at work today?" "No," Dad said, looking at her speculatively. "Well, Stubbins was changing the no-slip grating on the walkways, but that's really not that weird, I guess." Are you sure nothing odd happened today?" she asked, trying to tiptoe around the matter so she didn't upset him. Sometimes Dad could have a temper, and none of us wanted to see it. "I guess, maybe," he seemed to think about it. "There was this guy I bumped into on the sidewalk. I fell down, and he helped me up, but it was nothing." When she continued to look at him skeptically, he set his fork down angrily and glowered at her. "Look, Martha, if you have something to ask, then just go ahead and ask it. I'm trying to eat here." "Dad, there's a huge hole in your freaking head." I was never what you'd call subtle. Dad wrinkled his eyebrows at me. "What in the hell are you talking about?" "There's a hole in your forehead. How do you not feel that? Are you trying to be funny? 'Cause you know I don't like jokes." Despite his gruff tone, though, he began feeling around his forehead, as if trying to find the source of discomfort. He seemed half-hearted, like he was just doing it as a favor by looking at it in the first place. But when his fingers touched the ragged edges of the hole, he shuddered a little. I didn't think it had hurt him, not really. It was more like the shudder you get when you have an itch and you scratch it. He inspected it with his fingers for a moment before getting up to look at it in the bathroom mirror. The three of us hovered just outside the door as he looked at it in the mirror, and we must have looked like some old comedy routine as we waited for his prognosis. After a few minutes of poking and prodding at it, he finally turned away and walked past us, leaving us just standing there. We found him at the kitchen table, eating his dinner like any other night. "Sit down. Your mother's meatloaf is getting cold," he told us, once he noticed we were there. "Dad," I started, but Mom put a hand on my shoulder. "Harold, there's a hole in your head. Don't you think we should go to the hospital?" Dad turned his emotionless gaze on her, making it clear that he didn't want to talk about it. When we didn't move, he growled in his throat in a deep, phlegmy way. "Doctor won't be able to do anything but poke at it and charge me an arm and a leg. Not going to no doctor. Now sit down and eat." Then he went back to eating, ignoring us until we returned to the table and ate as well. We all tried not to notice the hole as we ate, but it was hard to ignore. As we sat and watched TV that night, the TV screen seemed to reflect off that dark hole. Mom laughed every time the audience did, but Dad never did. Well, that's not entirely true. Dad did this thing when he found something funny. 1 part chuckle and 9 parts phlegmy rumble. When I was a kid, I had asked Mom once why Dad never laughed or smiled, and she told me that he laughed often and smiled daily. "It's just hard to tell with your father. he's not quite as obvious about it as the rest of us are. After that, I started paying more attention to Dad, and I'd come to the point where I could pick up on the subtle twitches at the corner of his mouth, the gravelly rumble when he chuckled, the minute crinkling at the edges of his beetle-black eyes. They helped me tell when my dad was in a good mood and when he felt less like hitting and more like patting, when you could ask him for a favor, when it was best to leave him alone. It was a talent my younger brother never learned, and it was a mistake that often earned him a cuff upside the back of the head when he'd try to hit Dad up for money. Dad was enjoying the byplay tonight as Raymond bemoaned everything from his mother to his job, but my mind was still firmly fastened on the hole. As I watched it, I almost fancied that I could see it expand and retract, as though it were breathing. I told myself it was the light from the TV, but the longer I watched, the surer I became that it was moving. It was like a ragged mouth, pulling in and pushing out air. It was subtle, like my father's moods, and the longer I watched, the more apparent it became. When my father turned his gaze on me, I realized he had caught me staring. Either go to bed or stop staring at me. You're creeping me out. I pushed off the love seat and went to my room. I knew I wouldn't be able to focus on anything as long as that hole was on display. The next few days were uneventful, I guess, but I noticed that Dad started wearing a hat when he went outside. I wished he would wear it inside, too, because the hole seemed to always be watching me whenever I was around him. It wasn't, of course, because it didn't have any eyes, but I could feel that itchy feeling you sometimes get when someone's staring at you. It looked like it was getting bigger, too. But if it pained Dad, he didn't say anything about it. He mostly ignored it, his only exception to ignoring it being the hat he wore outside. Dad was stubborn, but he wasn't foolish. Dad was a sensible person who liked to keep attention off himself. Over the next 10 days, the hole got noticeably bigger. When we'd first seen it, it had been maybe big enough to put your pinky finger inside. Now I could have easily put several in there, and still he refused to go to the hospital. Mom tried to coax him, but he said it wasn't worth bothering a doctor over. If it was bad, it would hurt, and it doesn't. If it means to go away, it'll do it on its own. He went to work, came home, watched TV, and all the time that hole continued to grow. I found myself looking at my father more and more often, that gaping chasm seeming to look at me, even when his hat was on. I started having dreams about that hole, and in my dreams it oozed and bled, and a single eyeball rolled around to look at me. No matter what Dad was doing in the dream, that eye stared at me until I came awake, gasping. Then one day, he came to breakfast, and the hole had taken in his eyebrows. It wasn't a hole now, it was more like a pit, a crater, that just so happened to sit in the middle of my father's head. Mom was left with an egg halfway to her mouth as she stared into that gaping void. We could all see it breathing now, the push and pull of its respiration as it drew in its terrible breath. Dad sat eating his own eggs and grits, pretending like nothing was wrong, but it was clear that he felt it too. He refused to answer any of us when we called his name, and left for work with his breakfast only half eaten. I noticed that when he came home from work that day, there was a different hard hat on the table in the entryway. The hard hat had a slant to it, and would better cover the hole. Dad may act like nothing was wrong, but I couldn't. I started avoiding him. I would come down to breakfast late, since I knew he'd be at work. I would make excuses to stay out so I could miss dinner. I did any number of other things to avoid being in the house, but it hardly seemed to matter. I had begun to hear some kind of strange whispering as I lay in bed at night, and it permeated my dreams as the eye inside began to whisper words I didn't understand. The words were alien, harsh and unwantable, but I felt I knew their meaning. My sleep became as ragged as my father's moods, and if I hadn't been barely into my senior year of high school, I think I would have moved out. Then about a month and a half after the spot appeared, Dad didn't come down for breakfast. Mom told us that Dad wasn't feeling well. She said he must have gotten sick in the night, but the way her eyes looked told me something beyond sickness was at play. He didn't go to work that day, and unknown to us, he would never go back to work again. Mom moved into the guest bedroom, and I wouldn't find out till later it was because Dad had locked the door and wouldn't let her in. We could hear him in there bumping around. Mom would leave food in the hallway, but we never saw him take it. This went on until one morning when I forgot my notebook upstairs. I'd been heading to school, leafing through my bag, when I realized I'd forgotten my biology notebook. I had a test that day, and I wanted to study before class. I was halfway up the stairs when I heard the door to my parents' bedroom open. I stopped halfway up, not sure whether I should continue or not. None of us had seen Dad since he went into hiding, and my brother and I had been very curious about what was happening with the hole. I put my fingers on the carpet and scrambled slowly up the stairs, peeking over the edge of the stairs as I heard the scrape of silverware being bumped. I could see my father's back, clad in a bathrobe and knee socks, as he bent over for the day's breakfast tray that my mom had left for him. He seemed to be having trouble grabbing it, and his hands threatened to knock over the juice that she had set beside the bowl of oatmeal. Then he stood up, and I had to put my hand over my mouth as he came into view. The top of his head looked like nothing so much as one of those cartoon holes they used to trap each other. It was a swirling black vortex that looked a mile deep, and as he turned to go back into the room, I could see the hole was like some kind of optical illusion. It was exactly as deep on the other side as it was on the back. He turned and took the tray back into the bedroom, but when he bumped the tray on the corner of the door, I realized why we had heard him banging around so much the last few days. In my dream, the hole always had an eye, but in reality, it had stolen my father's sight. The dreams became different after that. Every night I dreamed that my family was eating around the breakfast table. My brother sat on my left, my mom sat on my right. Dad sat across from me, bent over his breakfast as usual. They all sat eating food from a massive pile, their breakfast more like a buffet. I seemed to be the only one paying attention to the strange creature wearing father's clothes, and the food he ate was pushed into the circle hole atop his head. As I watched, the eye emerged again, but it wasn't alone this time. The eye was in a face, and the face was long and terrible. The skin was tan and leathery, like a hide left out in the sun too long. The hair was white and fine, like a corpse's. The teeth were jagged and yellow, its eyes the cataract threads of the chronically blind, and when its face rolled around to look at me, I would shake as its lips rose in an almost comical grin. As everyone ate, the mouth opened, and a low whisper began to assault my ears. Every night, that whisper became a little louder, and over time, I came to understand the words. Shally shally may ray, fori fori may gra, lee raleigh grega, su raleigh drema. The words slid into my ears like slugs, coating my brain in the forbidden knowledge they possessed. I wasn't sure what the dream meant, but I knew that they were meant for me. Was this the thing that had been staring at me the whole time? Was this the reason I had felt watched? As the dreams continued, I began humming or reciting the words that spoke to myself during the day. I would catch myself making little rhymes out of it, and they were never far from my mind. It was almost soothing to speak those words, a balm to the terrible dreams and the terrible fear that wormed its way through my mind. I knew what it wanted me to do, and one night, I did my part. I needed to use the bathroom in the middle of the night, my bladder full to bursting. I was leaving the bathroom when I noticed that the door to my parents' room was open for the first time in a long time. There was a noise coming from inside, and it sounded pained. I thought maybe one of the dogs had gotten in there and gotten hurt, but I think even then, I knew what I would find. Dad was on the ground, his swirling head practically hyperventilating as it pulled in and out. The swirls had taken in Dad's shoulders and the top of his chest. He was lying on the floor, flopping around as his arms protruded from the vortex. I reached down and helped him sit with his back to the bed. He couldn't talk, probably couldn't even see, but he seemed to understand that I was there to help him. As I looked at the swirling mass, though, I felt the words come to my lips. I don't know if they were intentional, but I know they were the words that needed to be said. Shally shally rayma, fori fori megra, lee raleigh grega, su raleigh drema. As the words fell from me, I saw something swirling in the mass of shadows. I was worried it would be the huge eye, like the one I'd seen in my dreams, but I was even more afraid that it would be the ancient face that I often saw amidst the vortex. As it swirled and thrummed, I could see the white hair beginning to sprout from the depths. The head was coming on fast, and as those eyes emerged from the depths, I could see the corners cast up in a smile. My shaky legs took me away from him with small, stuttery steps. His face came free of the murk, but it wasn't done yet. As his head slid free, a withered form emerged beneath it. He was naked, looking like some kind of wizened mummy as his leathery skin slid from the dark pool. Below the dark pit that had made up my father's head, his body began to shrivel up like a 4th of July firework, becoming blackened embers before my eyes. The more of that evil thing that came free, the less of him there was, and when his withered feet touched down on the soft carpet of my parents' bedroom, what remained of my father simply blew away. The old man reached down for the grubby bathrobe that Dad had been wearing, and tittered as he pulled it around himself.
"Took you long enough, but I guess I can't be upset. You and your father have served me well, though you never realized you were doing it. Your reward is not sharing in his fate. Your punishment is knowing you are responsible for my return to this world. What you do with these gifts is up to you."
Then he left, just walked out of our house and into the night. As the sun comes up over my mother's kitchen, I realize I've been writing this since I managed to get back to my feet and walk shakily down the stairs. I've been trying to write down as much of this experience as possible so I won't forget any of it. But it's so weird, and it's hard to put it all into words. What the hell was that thing that ultimately killed my father? Did it make the hole in his head? Why him? As I sit here watching the sun come up, I realize I may never know. Michelle huffed angrily as she noticed that her dream catcher had fallen off the ceiling again. She checked under the bed, behind the nightstand, even in the bathroom in case it had rolled inside. Nothing. No dream catcher, no sign of where it had gone. It wasn't as if this was uncommon or anything. Michelle had been replacing dream catchers for most of her life, but the older she got, the more annoying it became. Michelle went to the closet and opened a box labeled Decor, sorting through dozens of dream catchers that she had inside. This just happened sometimes. It had happened since she was young, and she'd gotten used to just replacing them. She picked up a frilly pink one, the leather around the ring dyed to match, but put it back. This one had been a gift, and she didn't want to waste it. She settled on a cheap neon blue one from the gas station and attached it to a hook over her bed. She hated to buy more, but the alternative was worse. The alternative was something that she hadn't experienced since she was very young. Michelle's mother had been fiercely spiritual. Trina Jones had stood out like a sore thumb among the community of strict Baptists and Methodists. Her mother had done a little of this and a little of that to get by, and Michelle had a tumultuous childhood. They lived in a little house that had been owned by her grandmother, and Michelle couldn't remember a time when her grandmother had come to the house for longer than a few minutes. She'd asked her why she never came over once, Michelle spending the night while her mother went to a concert with some friends. She and her grandmother had been shelling peas on the porch of Grandma's house, just on the other side of the block, and her grandmother's scowl had been hard to miss at the time. "I hate to see what your mother's done to that house. It offends my senses, but God forgive me, I won't cast her out. She's free to live her life however she likes, but that doesn't mean I have to let her rub it in my face." Her mother had an odd hodgepodge of beliefs, and Michelle could remember all of them jostling together in the living room of their small house. Trina, though her grandmother had always called her Grace, was an old hippie, and she had been taken with paganism and druidic ideas as she followed her friends on the road before Michelle was born. She had also liked the ideas of Buddhism, Taoism, and several other Eastern spiritualities. As such, the living room was often crowded with altars, statues, and other paraphernalia for whatever ritual or rite her mother was working on. The dream catchers were a part of it. Michelle had always suffered from terrible nightmares, and her mother had hung the dream catchers over her bed since she was very young. Her mother had also noticed the rate at which the dream catchers disappeared, but if she knew why, she never said. To Michelle, it was always just a fun mystery that never seemed to have an answer, like where the socks went when you lost them in the dryer. Michelle hung the new dream catcher over her bed and got back to getting ready for work. She had bills to pay and, inevitably, more dream catchers to buy. She found herself thinking back to the mystery of where all the dream catchers went as her workday slowed down. She tried to puzzle out where they might be disappearing to, but ultimately came up with nothing. As a kid, she had tried everything. She had nailed them to the ceiling. She had set up little nets to catch them if they fell. She had gone so far as to set up a little camera one night to see if someone was taking them. But the recordings had stopped at 11 when it ran out of tape. She hadn't really thought about it in a long time, but the more she pondered it, the more curious she became. She made a mental note to set up her phone camera tonight and see if she could find out what was taking them. The phone wouldn't run out of tape, unlike her video camera, and maybe she could figure out what was going on. 4 nights later, and 3 deleted 8-hour recordings later, Michelle woke up to find her phone knocked over and her neon blue dream catcher missing. The video that she scrolled through that day at lunch was less than helpful. The phone had recorded the dream catcher until about 2 a.m., seeing nothing but the dust motes and the circles of feathers on the strings that hung from the ceiling. Then, at 2:07, Michelle heard a soft sound like a latch being slid, and the window had whispered open. A shadow passed over the camera, which was knocked over a few seconds later. No matter how many times she rewound the footage, Michelle couldn't tell what had knocked the camera over. It recorded nothing else but darkness for the rest of the night, until she had picked it up in the morning and turned it off. That gave her something new to worry about. Who was stealing her dream catchers, and why? Surely it couldn't be the same person all these years. She'd been losing dream catchers since she was 3 years old. She had moved 2 states away from her childhood home and moved into 3 different dorm rooms before settling into this apartment. It couldn't be the same person. But then, who was it? As she sat in traffic that day, she felt moved to call her mother, and as she dialed the number, she felt silly. What did she think her mother was going to do about it? Her mother had been a rolling stone ever since Michelle had left home 3 years ago, and the notion that she'd even be reachable was laughable. Trina had been the big push for her to accept the offer from Tennessee State College. She'd set her daughter down, pulling her away from her studies as she tried not to bomb her final and lose her acceptance letter. She told her that she'd been sent a spiritual vision and that it was time for her to travel. This vision didn't have anything to do with her latest man, Beau, and had everything to do with her wanderlust needing to be satiated. I'll stick around long enough for you to graduate, but after that, I'm hitting the road and giving the keys back to your grandmother. Michelle hadn't talked to her much in those 3 years, but she thought she might have some insight in this. She picked up on the 4th ring, and Michelle could hear soft guitar music and the sounds of laughter in the background. "Hey, sweetie, what's the occasion? I haven't heard from you in months." I need to talk to you about something. I'm a little scared, and it's kind of important." Michelle heard the sound quiet as her mother walked away or stepped into someplace. "What's wrong, Micah? You need a reading or some crystal healing? I can send you some vibrations through the phone if you—" But Michelle cut her off before she could get going. If she let Trina get rolling, they'd be on the phone all night. "I need to know about the dream catchers. Why did they go missing?" There was a long pause, and Michelle was worried that she had lost her. "Mom, are you still hanging them?" she asked. And it wasn't the voice she was used to hearing from her mother. It was low and scared, at odds with her mother's usual gregarious nature. "Of course, but I've been thinking a lot about them lately, and I just— Don't stop hanging them, Michelle. I know it's a pain, but trust me, they help. But why do I— Just—" She paused as she got control of herself again. "Just keep hanging them. If you need more, I'll send you some. I know a guy out there who makes them, and he owes me a favor. I'll get you some in bulk, but please, just hang them. And stay safe." "Safe from what?" Michelle asked, getting frustrated. Her mother had never been this serious, and it scared her more than the video had. Her mother clearly knew something, but she wouldn't tell her. She had never been good at keeping secrets, and Michelle didn't understand why she wanted to start now. I gotta go. She seemed to gather her thoughts as she tried to find a way to explain. "Just keep hanging them, and stay safe. I love you, Michelle. I'll send you some dream catchers soon so you don't run out." Then she hung up on her, and Michelle was left confused and agitated. She thought about what her mother had told her for the rest of the night. The way she had acted scared Michelle, and the transition from her mother's nickname to her real name had made it all the more jarring. Her mother had started calling her Micah when she was a kid, thinking it sounded more earthy, and Michelle hadn't heard her use her real name in quite a while. She had started to hang a new dream catcher, but paused midway through trying to hook it up there. The more she thought about it, the more she saw no reason to hang a new one. She'd had bad dreams when she was younger, but it was something that she hadn't experienced in a long time. Who's to say that the dream catchers had done anything? She froze there, unsure whether to proceed, and finally, she just tossed the dream catcher onto the nightstand. She'd sleep without it tonight and see what happened. Worst case scenario, she had a bad dream that night and would wake up and put a new one up. It took some time to get to sleep, but Michelle was sure that tonight would be as fine as all the others before it. When she woke up midway through the night, she was glad. The dream she'd been having was terrifying, but it was nothing compared to what she had woken up to. Her dreams had been incredibly dark. She had woken up in a hellscape, the sky constantly burning as the rain came down in runners of flames. She was lying naked on the hard stone, her body pulled close as she shuddered. All around her there were creatures gathering, their growls like thunder. She closed her eyes, trying to wake up, but it just never seemed to happen. She was stuck, waiting for these creatures to come in on her, and as the first lunged at her, its bony mouth snapping, she came awake like a deep sea diver from the depths. She thought for a moment that she was still sleeping, until she felt the pressure in her ear. She had never felt anything so intimate, so violating, and the feeling made her shudder in utter terror. She swiveled her gaze to the left and saw something large and pale crouching beside the bed. It looked like a giant white bug, its body pale and wrinkled. It was hunkered below the side of the bed, like a kid wanting to ask a question. Its bald head gleamed in the moonlight, and Michelle realized that her window was open again. The long red tongue that slid over the edge of the bed and into her ear was as hard to miss as the pale horror kneeling there. The tongue bulged her eardrum, making her head feel far fuller than she was used to. It felt like it might be going all the way to her brain. What was he doing? Was he trying to eat her? What was going on? The tongue slid soupily out of her ear as his piss-yellow eyes grew large. He had noticed that she was awake. As it reached its full height, Michelle realized how big it was. 7 feet tall, each arm tipped with 6 long claws. As it loomed over her, Michelle worried that it would finish what it had started. Its long tongue slid over its thin lips, and they turned up at the corners as it took her in.
"Don't worry,"
it whispered, its voice high and waspish.
"I need you alive so I can continue to feed. I must admit, it's nice to get a taste from the source again. I usually get your tasty floating snacks, but today I got a real treat from the old country."
Its tongue slid over its lips again, its face a rapture as it remembered the flavor. It climbed out of her window, its body groaning as its bones leaned into the twists. But Michelle felt utterly paralyzed. She didn't understand what was going on. What in the world was that? Had that been what her mother had been trying to protect her from? Had she known about it? Why hadn't she just told her? Michelle pulled her knees to her chest, the terror sending shudders up her frame, and as the birds began to chirp and the sun sent pink fingers over the edge of her window, she finally reached for her phone. Her mother sounded sleepy when she picked up, but it sounded like she might have been expecting the call. "So, you saw it, then?" Michelle couldn't answer right away, managing only a small grunt of acknowledgement. "Did it hurt you? It never did when you were a kid, but you knew it would come after me then?" It wasn't a question. When you were young, you started having night terrors. You would wake me up every night with the most terrible screaming, and I didn't know what to do. Worse than that, you drew pictures of the dreams the next day. Flaming skies, terrible creatures, just the bleakest places imaginable. I didn't know what to do. One night I woke up before you started screaming and felt like I needed to go make sure you were okay. That was when I saw it. He was leaning down over you, his tongue coming out of your ear, and he seemed to be drinking something out of your head. He ran when he saw me, bending out of the window like a serpent, and that only deepened my confusion. That was when I tried the dream catchers. It was on a whim. I didn't know whether it would work, but when it stopped your night terrors, I thought that maybe it kept him away. When they started disappearing, I figured out what was going on. She stopped, collecting her thoughts, and Michelle could hear the sounds of crickets making music in the background. Wherever she was, it was someplace green. Michelle could almost see the trees and feel the breeze, and she suddenly wished that she was with her. Was this why Mom had traveled so much? Was she running from something too? Michelle suddenly realized how little she knew about her mother, and wished that she had taken the time to learn more. The dream catchers don't do anything besides what they're supposed to. They take your dreams and store them inside those strings. Whatever these things are, and I mean things because I don't believe there's just one of them. They like eating your nightmares. The dream catchers distract them, give them something to eat instead. That's why you need to keep hanging them. Michelle wanted to ask more, wanted to know if her mom had any idea about the places she saw in her dreams, but instead, she just reached for the dream catcher on her nightstand. I'll be in touch, Michelle whispered, hanging up as she stood on the bed to attach it to the ceiling. She wouldn't feel safe again until it was back in place. In truth, Michelle wondered if she'd ever feel safe again. I've been searching for this tape most of my life. I've thought about nothing else since it was taken from me 12 years ago. As I sit in my grandmother's bedroom, holding the familiar red plastic in my hands, I feel a sense of inner peace. I know that my search is over, and that serenity can follow. Mr. Harzows Corner was a show that I watched religiously from the age of 4 to 6. It wasn't some mysterious TV show that I saw on basic cable. It wasn't some scrambled signal I got from a weird public access network. It was actually something I found at a church rummage sale. The box of VHS tapes was sitting on a little table with the words 5 for $1 scrolled across it in permanent marker. I had leafed through it and seen the usual church swap meet stuff. Winnie the Pooh, Veggie Tales, all the Disney movies with their cracked plastic windows and dirty fingerprints on the names. But nothing really stood out. I had selected a few Winnie the Pooh episodes when I found the dirty plastic cassette near the bottom. It had a lurid red body, the color similar to old lipstick, and a handwritten name on the front. The black magic marker name read Mr. Harzows Corner, and it immediately caught my attention for some reason. I picked it up and just looked at it for a moment. I had grown up in an age of strange cassette tapes. Nickelodeon put out the chunky orange cassette tapes that often had episodes of Rugrats or Wild Thornberrys, and even some of the VeggieTales cassettes were different colors, depending on whether they were holiday specials or not. This one, however, seemed odd right off the bat. The plastic just felt thick in my fingers, and I remember both wanting to put it down and never put it down again. Finally, after 10 minutes of just looking at it, I did put it down, and I grabbed 2 cassettes featuring episodes of Barbie's Dream House, a Nickelodeon cassette featuring the Rugrats, and 2 with handwritten names saying they were old Winnie the Pooh cartoon episodes. I brought them to my mom, and after looking over them, she nodded and gave me $1. I had taken them to Miss Wazowski, the cheery old lady who often organizes these rummage sales, and she put them in a plastic grocery bag and smiled at me as I walked to rejoin my mom. It wasn't until I got home that I realized there was a 6th tape in that bag, though. I had just turned on the VCR TV combo in my room when I realized there was an unfamiliar, yet very familiar red cassette tape at the bottom of the bag that had definitely not been there when I'd checked out. I picked it up and saw that Mr. Harzows Corner was scrawled across the front, and it was weird that I didn't remember picking it up at all. Instead of putting it back, I put it in the VCR and watched as the static began to clear on the screen. I had been intending to watch some of the Winnie the Pooh episodes, but the bag of tapes would sit forgotten for quite some time. Mr. Harzows Corner would be the only thing I really cared about for the foreseeable future. The show appeared to be nothing special. It was clearly a Mr. Rogers knockoff, but the Mr. Harzow character was strange, yet endearing. He looked normal enough, a slight blonde guy, taller than your average kids show host, with a corduroy jacket and a pair of battered jeans that covered the tops of his Reebok sneakers. The camera showed him coming into a normal living room, again very reminiscent of Mr. Rogers, and then greeting everyone with a big smile and a waving hand. "Good afternoon, boys and girls. And of course, a very special afternoon to children of all ages. Welcome to Mr. Harzows Corner. Know that I am glad to see you, and that I am always here, just for you." As it went on, Mr. Harzows Corner turned out to be nothing like Mr. Rogers' neighborhood. Mr. Rogers often taught children life lessons about accepting people and being a friend, and lessons about how the world worked. Mr. Harzows Corner was more like having your own personal therapist inside your TV. Mr. Harzow taught no life lessons. He went on no adventures in make-believe. He just sat in his big easy chair with a cup of tea at his elbow and listened. First time I watched the episode, I was a little bit confused. After his greeting, he just leaned back and looked at me, smiling in a very strange way. His smile was warm, inviting even, but he seemed to be waiting for someone on the other end of the camera to begin talking. He just sat there staring at me, and I began to become a little creeped out. Even at 4, I knew it was a little bit unusual for adults to just sit there and stare at you. I remember reaching out to hit stop on the tape when suddenly Mr. Harzow cocked his head and seemed to speak directly to me. "Leaving so soon? I understand. Well, I'm glad you came to see me today. I hope you'll come again very soon." My fingers stopped over the button. Was he talking to me? It seemed like he had been, but this was just a VHS tape. This was an age before interactive tapes, and the idea that the VHS could talk to you was a little eerie, but also a little bit interesting. When he had spoken directly to me, I had remembered feeling a little sad that I was leaving already. He seemed like he understood, but maybe he was a little sad to see me go as well. I recalled my hand, and that big grin spread across his face again. "Changed your mind? I'm so glad. So why don't you tell me about your day? I'm sure I'd love to hear all about it." I sat for a moment, thinking about what to do. Finally, I told the smiling stranger on the tape about my day. I told him about my mother, and going to the rummage sale, about finding his cassette tape, about bringing all the cassette tapes home, and discovering that his cassette tape was in with the ones I'd bought. I told him I hoped I wouldn't get in trouble for having 6 instead of 5 cassette tapes, because my mother would think I had stolen it and she would get mad. Through it all, Mr. Harzow just sat and nodded, smiling his smile and listening as if I had the most interesting things in the world to talk about. Even at 4, though, I began to think that this was just someone pretending to listen. I remember thinking back to shows like Dora the Explorer, where Dora would ask a question and then pretend to listen to your answer. No matter what you told her to do, whether it was to go towards the next thing she had to do or sit in the grass and look at the clouds, she always came up with the right answer and went off to do what she was supposed to. I assumed that Mr. Harzow would do the same. He would interrupt me any minute now, just like Dora did if you spoke for too long, and start on some pre-scripted bit of dialogue. But he didn't. He sat and listened politely until I was done speaking. Then he nodded and answered me as if we were two people having a normal conversation. "It sounds as though it's been an exciting day for you. I'm glad you got to go and do something important, something that you enjoy. It's a real honor to be part of your life, and I hope we can be friends for many years to come." I spent the rest of the day in my room, talking with Mr. Harzow and telling him about my family, my home, and my life. He always seemed interested in my stories, and he always listened with that big smile and that fatherly way of talking about everything. My mom called me for dinner, and he said he would wait for me to come back. When I returned, he was still sitting and looking at the screen like I had never left. He asked me about dinner, and we talked until it was time for me to go to bed. "Will I see you tomorrow?" he asked, and I assured him that he would. I nearly left the TV on and just went to bed, but something told me that might be a bad idea. Not because the tape was cursed or haunted, but because Mom might come in and find it on. She might talk to Mr. Harzow, and Mr. Harzow might decide to be her friend instead of mine. The thought of losing Mr. Harzow, even after such a short time, made me feel furious, and I turned off the tape and went grudgingly to bed. I spent the next 5 months with my nose pressed against the TV screen, and Mr. Harzow listening to all my problems and woes. When my mom grounded me after the dog knocked the lamp over, he listened and consoled me. When my dad accidentally bumped me and I fell down the last 3 stairs, he was the one who told me it would all be okay. Every childhood problem, every unforeseen event, Mr. Harzow was there for me. It wasn't just that he listened. It wasn't even his advice that made me love him so. When Mr. Harzow talked to you, you felt like you were the most important person in the world. His attention was the most important thing you could ever have, and my 4-year-old brain drank that attention in. I became hesitant to leave the house, making up excuses why Mom couldn't go places, since I'd have to come with her. I wanted to spend every waking moment with my new friend, but something on the horizon would leave me with even less time with my dear Mr. Harzow. When I had to start kindergarten, Mr. Harzow told me how it would be new and exciting, and how he wanted to hear all about it when I got home. I attended kindergarten for about a week, coming straight home to lay on the floor of my room and talk with my new friend. When Mom got a new job. She had landed a job as a tech support supervisor for a new company, which meant she couldn't take me after school anymore. Dad worked in a prison, so he was almost always at work. It began to look like I might have to go into after-school care. I was understandably upset about this, because it would limit the already slim time I had to chat with Mr. Harzow. Fortunately, there was an alternative. My grandmother agreed to take me after school. My grandmother lived alone, my grandfather having died before I was born, and I think she was excited about watching me. Grandma had been very sad since my grandfather's passing, and it had turned her into a quiet shell of her former self. My mom always talked about what an outspoken and vivacious woman my grandmother had been when she was younger, and now it seemed like I might get to meet this new grandma. As bad as it sounds, I wasn't really all that interested in any of it, though. I simply wanted a place with a VHS player so I could watch my tape. At first, that was all we did, too. Grandma would pick me up from school, asking how my day had been, and asking what I might like to do once we got home, and I would tell her that I wanted to watch my tapes in the den. She would offer to bake cookies with me or maybe take me to the park, but I was fully invested in the silky voice of Mr. Harzow. I would come in and lay my book bag down and go sit in the den for hours as I talked quietly to my good friend about everything and anything. He smiled when I told him about my grandma and said it was nice that I was keeping her company. Grandmothers are such a valuable resource of knowledge, and the fact that you have such a good relationship with yours is truly special. I agreed, but I was still very guarded about the tape. I would often turn it off when Grandma brought me snacks or asked if I was interested in going outside. I didn't want her to see Mr. Harzow, and I think I was still afraid that she would take him away from me if she saw him. She would want him to be her friend, and then I would be unable to see him since he would want to spend all his time with her. Mr. Harzow never said as much. All of his advice was placidly given through the TV after he had sat and listened to me. But I knew that if I coveted this tape, then others might as well. Over time, Grandma did manage to coax me out of the den. I was 5 after all, and the smell of cookies or the promise of ice cream had a talismanic effect on me still. Mr. Harzow became an after-dinner friend, a rainy day friend, but I still found myself wanting to spend as much time with him as I could. No matter what I was doing, playing on the swings or sitting in class or making cookies with Grandma, or even sleeping in my bed, it seemed that I was thinking about Mr. Harzow. I would find myself hungry for any time I could get with him, and there were nights that I quietly whispered to him from the floor of my room as my parents slept not too far away. It didn't come to a head until I got careless at Grandma's house one day. It had been the best day my 6-year-old brain could remember. Grandma had taken me to the local carnival, more of a street fair than a regular fair, and I had done it all. I had ridden ponies, I had eaten so much I thought I would bust, I had seen clowns and jugglers and listened to bands, and for a moment I'd even stopped feeling the tug of Mr. Harzow. We came home and I ate dinner, and Grandma asked me if I wanted some TV time before my mom came to pick me up. I said I did, and I rushed off to tell Mr. Harzow about all the exciting things I had done and seen, and he laughed and told me how much fun it all sounded like. As he spoke, I remember yawning as his pleasant voice drifted over me, and when I felt my face drifting towards the carpet, I don't even think I was aware I was going to sleep. When I woke up in my bed the next morning, I was confused. When I couldn't find my videotape in my bag before school, I was frantic. I thought about it the whole way to school and decided that I must have left it at Grandma's house. I had fallen asleep in front of the little TV in the guest room, and so the tape must still be there. I figured it wouldn't be a problem. Grandma was going to come pick me up after school, so I could get it while I was there. When my mom picked me up instead, I was a little bit confused. "Sorry, sweetie, but Grandma's sick, so she can't take you today." Mom had taken off work for the afternoon to pick me up, and I spent the afternoon walking around the house like a junkie. I hadn't been without my tape for the last few years, so being without it now was like torture. I tried to go out and play, but I just couldn't get interested in any of the games. I tried to watch TV, but none of my favorite shows seemed to hold my attention. I just walked around aimlessly, wanting to talk to Mr. Harzow. I'd had a pretty good day that day. He would want to hear about it. He would want to hear about how my team had won at dodgeball, about how my sculpture had been praised by the teacher in art class, about how I'd made a new friend. Not being able to tell him was torture, but I knew I had to stay strong. Grandma would be better tomorrow. I just knew it. It turned out Grandma was sick that whole week, though. By the end of that week, I was becoming a mess. My parents just saw it as me being a hyperactive kid, but I felt like I was actually going through withdrawals. Sometimes I would just lie on the floor, knees tucked to my chest, and hyperventilate. I remember vividly the feeling of my breath as it rushed out and rasped wetly against my skin. I remember feeling like I might vomit, but being unable to bring up anything. I remember my dad finally taking me and putting me in my room one Saturday, because I had done nothing for 3 hours but stare at the ceiling and shudder. This will sound dramatic to you as you sit in your nice warm house. You'll think I was just overreacting or being a spoiled child who couldn't get their way. Some of you, though, the ones who have loved something self-destructive and lived through it, might understand what it was like. After a week, I asked my mom if maybe we could go visit Grandma. I told my mom I was worried about her and wanted to see her. We were driving back from school, Grandma having been sick all week, and the idea suddenly occurred to me that maybe we could go check on her. Anything at this point to get my fix. Mom had knocked about 20 times when she finally used the spare key to open the lock and head inside. I was in as soon as the gap in the door was big enough. The house looked different, but I hardly noticed. I was charging down the hall to the guest room, Mom calling for my grandmother as she came inside behind me. The door to the little guest room was ajar, and I crashed through it and knelt before the silent altar of that cold little TV on the floor. I pushed the button, but nothing happened. I pushed it again, but still nothing happened. I peeked into the VCR slot and found it empty. Someone had taken my tape. I came hobbling from the room on all fours, probably possessed of that "give us the precious" look old Smeagol showed to Frodo far too often. I heard Mom in the kitchen, still looking for my grandma, but I only had one thing on my mind. Mr. Harzow had to be here somewhere. At the bottom of the stairs, I stopped, cocking my head like a dog as I listened. I could hear him. I could hear Mr. Harzow. I could hear the melodic sound of his voice. I could hear the soothing tones that had so often told me that everything would be fine. I had craved that voice for the past 7 days, and now it was so close I could almost taste it. I ambled up the stairs as quiet as I could, pressing my ear to the door of my grandma's room. I could hear him telling her how he understood her woes and commiserated with her sorrow. I shoved the door open, looking into the squalor that had become my grandmother's room. It was filthy. A smell like waste just left to drop where it would assaulted my nose, along with the smell of spoiled food. Grandma was perched on the bed like a gargoyle, her eyes glued to the little TV on the nightstand. The glow from it illuminated her face like a death mask. It had only been a week, but she looked so haggard and so old that it almost scared me to look at her. She jumped when I screamed at her to give me back my tape. She covered the TV, the screen making her eyes shine with lust as the two of us yelled at each other like angry cats. I told her how unfair it was that she could just take things from me, and demanded that she give it back. She said it was her tape now, and that she would never give it back. In the background, I could also hear the consoling voice of Mr. Harzow as he told us to both find a compromise, and that fighting was never the answer. I could hear Mom downstairs, her feet pounding up the hardwood, the sound of us fighting having galvanized her. Mom walked in just as Grandma dealt me a vicious slap across the cheek, rocking my head to the side and sending me sprawling to the floor. I can remember the two of them shouting at each other as easily as I can remember my favorite television show. They never came to blows, but it was very close a few times. Mom wanted to know just what the hell was going on. Grandma kept shrieking that she wanted us out, all the while clutching her murky television set. She said we were not welcome here anymore. She said she never wanted to see us again. She said that she would call the police if we didn't leave immediately. All the while, I could hear Mr. Harzow whispering for her not to do such a thing, for her to work out her problems, to reconcile with her loved ones. Far from making her see reason, hearing her voice only seemed to harden her resolve. Hearing his voice only made me want to bask in the glow of that murky television set all the more. Finally, we left, my mother weeping openly as she dragged me kicking and screaming down the stairs. That was the last time I heard his voice. For 12 years. You would say that after 12 years I might have forgotten about Mr. Harzow. You might think that after 12 years I would have surely moved on with my life. You might assume that I would find other hobbies and interests besides talking to a man that lives inside a VHS tape. You would be wrong. Dead wrong. When it became apparent that I couldn't get the tape back, I started searching. This was the early days of the internet, and I started furiously pursuing information online about similar tapes or similar programs. I didn't find much. There were a handful of people who were clearly just playing around, a few others who were trying to use the tape, and my obvious desire for it, to lure me into something terrible. Neither of these bothered me much, but the others showed me something I didn't want to see. Becky and Steven were two users I spoke to on a forum, who believed they had actually come into contact with Mr. Harzow. Both had the kind of conversations with me that smack addicts likely had with each other. They spoke of their time with him lovingly, their words painting a picture of almost worshipful need. Becky said she had spent 10 years with Mr. Harzow before her mother had taken her television and thrown it out. She locked Becky in her room, and Becky had been forced to watch the truck come and take the TV, VHS and all away forever. Steven had a similar story, but his tape had been destroyed in a fire when his house had burned to the ground. That was 2 years ago when I found them, and I had no idea how much they would affect my search. About a year after meeting Steven, he stopped talking altogether. Becky and I assumed that something must have happened to him. He had been teetering lately, rolling in the memories of his time with Mr. Harzow, like a dog rolling in a smell it likes, and he had been talking about self-harm a lot. When he didn't sign on for about a week, Becky and I assumed he had finally had enough of dwelling on something that he couldn't have. His last message read, "I'll be with him soon." Becky, on the other hand, saw an opportunity that I never would have foreseen. She had been asking a lot of very loaded questions about where I lived, and more importantly, where my grandmother lived. You see, Grandma was still alive, even after 12 years of living under Mr. Harzow's watchful eye. No one had seen her, no one had heard from her, and she just sort of lived off her retirement and her slowly deteriorating house. I had walked by a few times, trying to find a way inside while she was away, but she never left. Her groceries were delivered, her mail spilled from her box, and she simply existed inside her crumbling tomb. I saw what Becky was after, and refused to tell her where she could find my tape. Becky, it seems, was more resourceful than I had thought, though. About a week ago, Mom got a call that Grandma had died. The police told us that someone had broken into her house, probably thinking it was abandoned, and found her in her bedroom. The two had fought, and despite her age, Grandma had strangled them to death. Her heart, however, wasn't quite as strong as her hands, and she had died with her fingers pressed into the flesh of the intruder. The intruder had been identified as Rebecca Smythe, a resident of California, who seemed to have driven 800 miles just to break into my grandmother's house. It seemed that my internet friend had finally pinpointed where my grandmother lived, and it had been the end of her. The night after the funeral, I made my move. I broke a window around back, we no longer had a key to the house, and made my way through the unfamiliar squalor. The house was a wreck, junk and garbage piled everywhere, and when I finally found the stairs, I breathed a sigh of relief. They were sagging, the wood groaning as I walked up them, but they were still intact, and my prize was within reach. The TV was on the nightstand, its soft glow illuminating the bed where Grandma had breathed her last. The tape sat in the murky light, like a red invitation or a jolly splash of blood. I've been holding it, feeling its red plastic in my fingers for nearly an hour, as I contemplate whether or not to slide it in. It's not a question of whether I will or not. I have missed Mr. Harzow desperately for the last 12 years, but I wanted to take down this story before I give my life back to him. You may think this is his fault somehow, but I cannot blame him for what has happened. He told my grandma on that long ago day to reconcile with us. He never told me to hurt anyone. He never told me to be unkind to anyone. I think that's why people seek him. When Mr. Harzow speaks, you feel as though he speaks only for you. He accepts you, no matter what, and that kind of power is intoxicating. The TV accepted the tape in just the same way it always had, and now he's smiling at me and welcoming me back as an old friend. I think I'll go speak with my old friend for a while. I think I'll go speak with him for the rest of my life. Have you ever met someone who changed your life so completely? Someone who's your first, your last, your only? I met her once. Her name was Sheela. I worked as an engineer in China. My company hired me straight out of college and offered me a substantial sign-on bonus if I would relocate to the mainland hub. Apparently, the company was responsible for many of the dams across China, and due to poor upkeep, many of the lawsuits leveled against them had been for machinery failure. My job was to check the machinery in the dams and make sure they were working correctly. It's a pretty lucrative job. After a few years, I find myself nearly fluent in the regional dialect. An American is something of a novelty for the people in these rural towns. I often find myself invited to bars or back to someone's house at the end of the day. The women have been very amicable, if not right out flirtatious. I usually don't find it difficult to find female companionship if I want it. Well, I didn't, at least. That was before I met Sheela, though. I was checking on a rather large dam near the coast, one that filters the often polluted river water and keeps debris from reaching the ocean. The dam's been leaking something caustic into the sea for a few months, and it was my job to figure out why it was doing that. I won't bore you with the technical details, but it wasn't hard to figure out what was going on. No one had bothered to dump the holding tanks that collect the pollutants, and they were leaking out into the dam walls and then into the ocean. No one had bothered to tell the workers to dump the tanks either. So a week of work and one pumper barge later, the dam was back up and keeping the ocean clean. That was apparently cause for celebration. The dam workers took me out for a few drinks that night. The local community, heavily centered around the fishing industry, wanted to meet me and thank me. A celebration was held, and I was introduced to everyone from the village mayor to the town priest. The mood was definitely festive, and I remember being handed a small cup of strong liquor early in. The clear liquor was quite potent, and after a while, the night became a jumble of colors and sounds. I danced and laughed and ate some of the best food I'd ever tasted. The whole village was so friendly that, after a while, I forgot to be self-conscious about my height or my nationality, and just let myself be immersed in the moment. I was sitting under an overhang, a fourth cup of the strong liquor at hand, when I saw a goddess approach me. Her hair was pale, not blonde, but white, and her dress was seafoam green and clung to her. She had the eye of every man there, and had the ire of every woman. I remember thinking that she didn't seem to fit the standards of this place. She was tall, almost as tall as me, and her skin was darker, tanned, brown. She looked foreign, vaguely Middle Eastern, and I remembered thinking that she looked like no one I'd ever seen before. She sauntered up to me, her eyes promising things her body was more than capable of keeping, and extended a hand to me. "Dance?" she asked, her voice gliding out like a midnight tide. I reached out, shakily, and took her hand. She pulled me up, not easy to do, considering I'm mostly muscle, and 6'2". As the music started, she began to spin me, and pull me in time with her own internal beat. We moved as galaxies moved, a solar system unto ourself, and when I looked at her, I could see her barely contained longing. She desired me. She wanted me. And when she pulled me close, I could feel her heart racing in her chest. Her breasts pressed against me through the dress, and her lips slid up my neck. I heard her whisper something in my ear that sent pins down my spine. "Come with me. Come with Sheela." She broke from me then, a teasing finger tempting me away from the dancers. I stumbled after her, the drink and the fire in my nethers piloting me easily. Did you say Sheela? Is that your name?" I slurred, letting her lead me towards the beach. She smiled and kept crooking her finger at me as we left the festivities. She led me through the sprawl of the little dwellings that butted up against the sea, and in my drunken state I was in no mood to think about what I might be doing. Her pale hair danced in the moonlight, and her tan skin shone so pale it was almost white. It turned her into a ghost, floating along before me as I stumbled on the rutted path. She beckoned me onward, and as I came, I could hear some exotic melody floating around us in the air. Then the dog began to bark, and the melody was snatched away. He wasn't much of a guard dog, some little mutt that had been tied up in someone's yard, but the effect he had on her was jarring. She recoiled as though she had been burned, and took a few shaky steps away from the animal. The dog was lunging at her, straining against its rope, and snarling like a wild thing. He was choking himself trying to get free, and his aggressive behavior seemed aimed solely at my companion. Watching him maul the air was starting to bring me out of my daze. Then Sheela rounded on him, and hissing at him like a scalded cat. The dog yarked and backpedaled to hunker under the porch, completely chastised. When she crooked her finger at me, the lovely music began to take me away again. We came to the beach, and she led me to a spot behind a stand of vegetation. There sat a hand-carved wooden boat bobbing in the surf. As I climbed inside, I felt the weight of the drink descend on me. I closed my eyes and felt the boat slip off into the waves. My fingers splashed into the spray when they took to the water, and I remember thinking that we were moving much too fast for a boat she was paddling. I'd seen no motor, and the boat looked like the kind that you would need big oars and strong arms to pilot. As we bobbed and floated in the churning soup, I let my mind focus on the strange music enveloping me, and drifted off for what couldn't have been longer than a few minutes. When I awoke, we were on a very different stretch of sand, and her hands were pressed against my chest, her face very close to mine. She smiled when she saw that I was awake. "Come," she whispered, and was off me and out of the boat with a cat-like grace. I rose from the boat much less gracefully, and as I looked across the water, I could see the lights of the little fishing village many miles away. I looked for the oars, but I didn't see them. I must have been out for hours, because there was no way she could have gone that far in a few minutes. The little boat bobbed in the shallows, having no anchor and no means to stay put either, and that confused me as well. Surely the tide must take it back out again without something to tie it down. Then the warm laughter of my guide and the soft music enveloped me again, and I followed her into the woods. A lush jungle lay not far from the boat, and she was standing at the edge and looking lovely in her green dress. She moved into the tree line, begging to be chased, and in the light of the moon, I dogged her steps as my drink-soaked brain processed only the need to have her. The jungle vegetation was lush and thick. On any other night, I would have been hesitant to plunge into there for fear of snakes or poisonous insects. That night, though, I blundered in with wild abandon, and the deeper I went, the deeper I was pushed to go. When I crashed into a small clearing, a burbling pool splishing placidly, I looked around wildly. She was nowhere to be seen, but I could still hear the music, and I knew she couldn't be far. Suddenly, the burbling became a loud expulsion of water, and she rose from the water like a nymph. I must have looked ghastly myself, one shoe missing, clothes torn and tattered from my wild run, and my face awash with mud and sweat. She approached me, however, as though I were some Greek god. She slid her soft hands over my cheek and pressed her cool lips against mine. She tasted exotic, like oils and spices and something unknown. She tasted like the grave, but I wouldn't know that until later. She broke our kiss and slid her mouth to my ear as she whispered her last request. "Dance for me." I felt my limbs go taut, like a puppet whose strings have been pulled, and suddenly I broke into a wild and frantic sort of dancing. The music in my head changed, becoming primal and dissident. My body threw itself wildly about. My throat erupted in earthy screams of ecstasy. I felt like one of those ravers in a mosh pit as my body danced out its primal need for her. She sat back against a rock, her dress hiking up to show me a pale leg that I was sure had been tanned earlier. Hadn't she looked exotic before? Vaguely Middle Eastern? Now her skin was pale as cream, and her white hair seemed brittle and corpsey as the moon spilled across it. Her dress suddenly seemed more like a funeral shift, and the green became mold as her cat-like eyes stared at me in the throes of my passionate dancing. I was a beast, a man on fire, and as I danced, I felt my limbs exerting themselves to the limits. My legs gave way first, spilling me head first onto the dirt. I rolled over, my arms still trying to dance, and I saw her creep forward like something from a horror movie. She scuttled ghoulishly, on all fours, and my limbs refused to heed any of the commands I was giving them. My legs twitched, trying to dance, but unable, and my arms kept thrashing and hitching feebly as she approached. I could see her staring at me from the soles of my feet as she peeked at me from between my toes. Then she opened her mouth very wide and popped the big toe of my left foot into her mouth. When she opened her mouth, I had seen a double row of sharp teeth that promised to strip my flesh even as they bit through the bone. As the toe entered her mouth, I knew I would never see it again. When she sucked the toe instead, I thought maybe I'd been mistaken. Perhaps she was just playing with me. Maybe the alcohol had made me hallucinate, and this was nothing but a gin-soaked dream. Then she bit the toe, parting it from my body as she chewed with an ecstatic look on her cannibal's face. I cried out, but my cries mixed well with the dance's primal scream. No one would hear me out here anyway. We were miles from civilization. Even the fishermen on their boat that might be close would probably think I was a strange night bird. No one was coming to my rescue, and my body had betrayed me in the wake of the strange song. I was her plaything, her prisoner, and she could do with me as she liked. The other 4 toes of that foot went down simultaneously. She crunched them with relish, her serpentine tongue sliding out to lick the blood from her lips. When the toes were gone, she took a bite of the now oddly shaped foot. The blood ran darkly from the nub, and she lapped at it hungrily as she chewed. My throat felt raw from screaming, the pain intense and throbbing, and as she took a second bite, I heard my voice giving out from crying. She looked up at me, seductively enough to make certain parts of my body quiver, and began planting biting kisses up my leg. The wounds were red and oozing, her lips now painted in my blood, and as she bit her way up, I began to realize her destination. I tried to break free of her spell, not wanting to be parted from that particular portion of my body, but I was helpless before her. She kissed her way up my leg, her mouth splitting and the cheeks ripping at the corners as she prepared to bite through the front of my trousers. Then a dog howled somewhere in the jungle, and she cast her eyes fearfully towards it. She stared in the direction for nearly a minute, seeming unsure of herself. She was rattled. The dog's howl had put her off, just like the one on the mainland had. She stared out into the forest, eyes searching frantically. When nothing came running out of the jungle to challenge her, though, she turned back to her helplessly dancing victim. I'll save you the gory details. Needless to say, it was the worst pain of my life. I watched her throat bulge as she swallowed them down, a look of pure bliss on her face. My warm blood pattered down her placid face as she closed her eyes and basked in the taste of me. She looked up then, cat eyes searching, and I thought she might be seeing my heart as it beat in my chest. She licked the blood from her lips and stalked up my chest, grabbing my arms and holding them down fiercely, so my feebly swinging arms couldn't hinder her. Her mouth tore open at the corners again, and I closed my eyes against the oncoming rip of her two sharp teeth. The various wounds ached and bled, and at that moment I was almost glad that it was about to end. I just wanted the pain to stop. That's when I heard the howl, closer now than it had been, and something big slammed into her side. It knocked her off me, sending her squealing and hissing and driving her weight off of my hurting body. When I opened my eyes, I realized that it wasn't a dog at all. It was a wolf, a big black wolf with white snarling teeth and a pair of piss-yellow eyes that looked furious. My mind was a jumble. I didn't remember hearing about wolves in China, but I was far from upset by his sudden appearance. He leapt onto the woman and tore into her with his snarling maw. She hissed at him, slapping at him with her long nails, but as she showed some signs of driving him off, another wolf barreled from the jungle to join the first. As I lay bleeding, 8 of the largest wolves I had ever seen came snarling from the vegetation to ring her in. She looked at them. As her eyes met with mine, her face was full of fear. They buried her in a ring of ripping teeth and furry bodies. I didn't waste time. I dragged myself away from the clearing with what little strength I had left, making for the beach that had been so close when I had 2 whole feet. As I pulled myself away, I could hear them tearing and ripping at her, her screams driving into my brain like an ice pick. If you've never heard someone get mauled to death by a pack of wolves, consider yourself very lucky. I could hear them savaging her as I bled and crawled, and I had no illusions of getting far before they fell on me as well. I was leaving a clear enough blood trail and panting loud enough to be heard from the mainland. As the sounds of their feast became farther away, I began to think I might be allowed to die in the jungle instead of eaten alive by wolves. I had no hope of finding the beach again. I only knew that I didn't want to die as she had. When my fingers sank into the sand an undeterminable amount of time later, I drew them back in surprise. I had never expected to find the beach, and now that the sound of water engulfed me, I knew I might be allowed to die on the beach in relative comfort. I dug my body out onto that beach, my various injuries crying out as the sand caked them and was ground into them. I dragged myself forward until I could feel the shore's wet edge, and then rolled onto my back and lay where the water might slide up and touch me as I was dying. It was cold fire against my injured foot, but I didn't care. The sound of waves would be a perfect backdrop for my last few minutes on Earth. I could still feel the blood leaking out of my foot and crotch, and knew I had lost a lot of it. I closed my eyes and prepared to die, when my eyelids were suddenly blasted by a bright light. I thought it was the sun for one pain-soaked moment. I thought I had fallen into a pain-induced shock and come to the beach by day. But when the lights went away, I opened my eyes in confusion. The light returned a moment later, and I shaded my eyes to see it wasn't the sun, but a searchlight. As it slid away, I saw it was on a little ship that was cruising towards the coast. When I flopped back down and closed my eyes again, it fell on me and it held me in its regard. I heard people yelling, speaking in the native tongue, and there was a splash of boats being lowered into the water. I tried to struggle when they came for me, fearing that they were with her, but my body had reached its limits. I blacked out as the strong hands lifted me from the sand. The last thing I remember was feeling my back on the hardwood and wondering if it would be the last thing I ever felt. I woke up on the mainland, though. I had been asleep for 3 days. The doctors told me that some fishermen from the village had heard me screaming and come to see if they could help. My left foot was 60% gone. My left leg was in danger of needing amputation, since some of the bites had festered. My groin was a tube now. My reproductive organs were bitten off completely, and I was fortunate to be alive. Any longer, and you would have likely bled to death. As I lay in the clean white hospital room, being told I would likely lose my leg, and had lost the thing that, at my age, made me a man, I didn't feel so fortunate. The police came and asked me questions about what had happened, but you could tell they didn't believe me. The island I had been found on was private property, a nature preserve, and no one in the area ever went there for fear of the animals that lived there. They sounded like they thought I was a weirdo, some sex freak that had gone a little too far, and when I told them that the wolves had eaten the woman who had done this, they scoffed. If the fishermen in the village hadn't corroborated my story about leaving with a woman, they would have likely assumed I had done this to myself. I'd still be in the dark if the old man hadn't come to visit. He told me his name was Lee, and he had been one of the fishermen who had found me on the island. They had left the party after his brother had told them who I had gone off with. He said I was fortunate to be alive. Many people who ran across the Sheela were not so lucky. The what? I asked. Sheela. They are old creatures that live on the island. They are spirits, he said, trying to find the words to explain it. Not like our spirits, but still spirits. They come from the union of a spirit of air and a human. They feed on human flesh and love to entice their prey to a secluded area so they can extend their time with them. You said creature. You mean there are more of them? I asked, horrified. He nodded. We lose men to the island sometimes. Many villages do. Like you, some come back scarred and broken, saved by the wolves who hate the Sheela. You are very lucky, son. Never forget that. I lay back in bed, cold and wanting to throw up, thinking of others who had been lured to the island and devoured by that hateful thing. That was 2 weeks ago. The doctors say I will get to keep my leg, but there's nothing they can do about my situation below the belt. My company has offered to pay my hospital bills and sent over paperwork for a sizable settlement if I don't pursue any legal action for being hurt on the job. I told them I hadn't been injured on the job, but they don't seem to want to take any chances. The settlement will be more than enough to get home and start some semblance of a new life. I can't do what I used to do with one foot, so that part of my life is clearly behind me. So many things are behind me now. I tell my story not to elicit pity, but to warn those who might travel to this part of the world. Be careful who you follow home. That pretty face might hide some sharp teeth, and you might find yourself following your date back to her lair. There are Sheela out there still, and I can attest that their hunger and their cruelty are not like anything you've ever seen before. Be careful, and don't be her next victim. The storm was one of epic proportions. It closed the schools for 3 weeks, right up until Christmas break. 4 days before Christmas, that was when I met her. Better not stay out too late or Soap Sally'll get ya. Mom called this after me, right as I went out the door to go play with Rob and Terrell. I rolled my eyes, slipping on my mittens as I grabbed my sled from behind the door. Sure, Mom, I'll be sure to watch out for Soap Sally. That was always what my mom told me. Her little attempt to scare me when I was a kid, I think. When I was younger, 4 or 5 maybe, Mom would use it to make sure I was inside before the street lights came on. I remember the first time she ever said it to me, the moment ingrained in my brain forever. I was heading out to play in the sandbox in the front yard, something Dad had spent all day building on his day off, and she had offhandedly told me to make sure I was in before the street lights came on, or Soap Sally would take me away. I had stopped, a little pail and shovel in my hand, and asked her who Soap Sally was. My mother just shrugged and said it was something her mother had always said, and the two of us had used it as our kind of personal joke from then on. Better get the groceries in before dark, Mom would say. Soap Sally might get you. Better hurry up and take the trash out, Mom would say. I think I hear Soap Sally prowling around. We'd done it for so long, it was just kind of normal. But I wasn't a baby anymore. I was 12, and I knew Soap Sally was just a boogeyman that adults used to scare kids. She was no more real than the Wampus Cat, another of my mother's colorful stories, and I put it out of my mind as I ran to join the others. Terrell had told us that his brother had told him about a big hill near Basker's Pond. It's so steep that when you come down it, you almost fly, he said. So I trudged through the fresh powder, over the streets that no longer looked like streets at all, and made my way towards the edge of town. My hometown isn't very big, one of those 2 stoplights and a gas station kind of places you always drive through on your way somewhere else. There were maybe 20 kids my age in town, and our whole school could have probably fit in your graduating class. We knew we were living in a podunk town in the Georgia hills, and most of us dreamed about getting out after high school and doing anything but staying here. For some of us, that dream was actually realized. For others, the cemetery was all we had to look forward to. I met Terrell near Basker's Field, a small little picnic area that butted up against Basker's Pond. The pond wasn't huge, but it was a great place to swim and fish in the summertime, and just, kind of enjoy yourself. Today, however, it was a winter wonderland of fresh snow and chilling wind. Terrell was bundled up to the eyebrows in a thick ski jacket, and his snow pants had little rolls in them that made him look a little like the Michelin Man. He, too, was clutching a battered old sled, and when he spoke, I could see the air puffing from his mouth, even under his hood. "'Bout time. Where's Rob?" That was when we heard a loud yell from up the road, and Rob came running with a banana yellow disc under his arm. He was wearing a matching ski suit and a pair of thick snow boots that seemed to be the only thing he wore that wasn't yellow. His voice cut through the sound of the wind like a foghorn, and I wondered if we were the only people in town not inside right now. It was a little spooky, even in the middle of the day. "Took you long enough," Terrell said. "Are you ready to sled?" "If this hill is half as cool as you say it is, T, then I'm ready to sled till midnight," Rob said excitedly. With that, we set off. We had all seen the hill in question. Overlook Crest was the place to spread your blanket on the 4th of July to watch the fireworks, or to picnic on, or to just sit and watch the boats as they went out there fishing during the warm months. It offered a great view of the water, and as we trudged up it, the hill felt twice as steep as usual. The snow made it slippery, and the three of us were laughing and pushing as we reached the top. Terrell won, of course. Terrell was a beefy kid, and he was harder to push down than Rob, who was mostly skin and bones. He set his sled against the snow, and when he slid down, he really did seem to fly. We spent the day on the hill, sledding, snowball fighting, making snowmen, and generally enjoying the day. Blizzards like these were rare, and we'd been having a lot of days like this where we were just free to be kids and enjoy our childhood. Sometimes we linked up with others from school to have snowball fights or play games, but mostly it was just Terrell and Rob, and me, of course, enjoying the childhood we had before it was over. We had all expected it to end when we went to high school, the dying place of childish things, and not one of us could have guessed that it might be something childish that ended our innocence. I didn't notice it was getting dark until the street lights came on and sent a dazzle of diamonds up from the snow. "Ah, crap. Mom's going to be mad if I'm late." "Oh, relax," Rob said. "It's not like we have school tomorrow. As long as you're home before bedtime, why would she care?" Rob's parents were never home, leaving him in the care of his aunts or his grandmother since they worked late. Terrell and I, however, had mothers and fathers who would expect us home when the streetlights came on, and I could see Terrell shuffling nervously too. We were all poised at the top of the hill, preparing to race to the bottom, and when Rob saw our looks, he rolled his eyes and jumped. "Last one to the bottom is a baby," he sing-songed. We all jumped then, putting on a burst of speed as we tried to catch him. As we came down, I began to hear a strange noise, the rumble of something rolling down the street, the jingle of an almost merry bell, and the hum of a gravelly voice. I looked around, trying to find the source of the noise, and that's when I saw her walk under a streetlight. It was an old woman, pushing a wheelbarrow or a small cart. We were heading right for her, and Rob was turned around backwards so he could laugh and mug at us. "Rob, look out!" He turned just in time to smack face first into the cart. We swerved to a stop, Terrell and I running down the hill the rest of the way. We could already see the old lady bending over him to inspect the prone boy, and under the glare of the street lights, he looked pretty bad. There was a big gash on his forehead, the blood leaving red streaks down his yellow ski suit. Rob was groaning when we approached, and the woman looked up at us, smiling feebly as she rose to her full height. She was as wide as she was tall, and she was nearly 6 feet. She wore a voluminous black dress, her hair caught in a scarf or a kerchief that trapped it against her head. Her hands were liver-spotted, her fingers long and spidery as they sank back into her sleeves. The cart she was pushing seemed to be empty, and I figured she was on her way to pick something up when we bumped into her. There was a bell attached to it, and Rob flopped back against it, making it tinkle merrily.
"Dear me, I didn't see you there, son. Are you okay?" she said in her thin, spidery voice.
We helped Rob to his feet, but he was shaky and hardly able to stand. I was worried that maybe he had a concussion, maybe even a broken skull, and I wanted to help him get to the house as quickly as I could. Terrell asked the woman if we could borrow her cart, but she said she needed it later and couldn't loan it out.
"But I'll help you get back to my cottage so you can call for help. I'll make you something warm to drink while you call your parents and let them know what happened. Put him in the cart now. You can help me push him back to my house."
I was hesitant. Mom was always clear on not taking rides from strangers, and certainly not going to their house. But Rob groaned and wobbled then, which made up my mind. Our town was so small, after all. We may have never seen this lady before, but there was very little chance that she would want to hurt us, right? No one ever wanted to hurt us, and despite all the lessons about stranger danger, we had never even heard of anyone getting kidnapped. We loaded Rob into the wagon, the bell jingling as he slid in, and pushed it back the way we had come. As it turned out, the woman lived in the woods behind Basker's Park. The tires rumbled over the wood chips that led to her house, and Rob groaned as we jostled him in the cart. We had left our sleds behind, and we moved unburdened towards the dark little cabin at the end of the long road. It looked spooky at night, not a candle or a light inside. "You can push him right in the front door," she gravelled out. As we neared, something screamed at me not to go inside that house, though. Common sense seemed to have reasserted itself, and when I paused on the steps to the front porch, the old woman and Terrell barely noticed. As the door came open, I could smell something like wax melting, a warm, aromatic smell of tallow. There were floral smells as well, and something akin to the cooking of bacon fat. There was another smell, though, something that prickled the hairs on the back of my neck. A coppery smell. A wet smell. And when I took a step back, the old woman seemed to notice that I hadn't come inside. She turned in the doorway, and we made eye contact for a few seconds, before she asked why I wasn't coming in. I just remembered that I thought of something, anything, and landed on a flimsy lie. "My dad, he's coming to pick us up, and if he gets there and we're gone, he'll be worried. I probably need to—" I turned to go back down the cedar path, but suddenly her hand was around my wrist. I felt my breath catch as I looked down at those long, spidery fingers. The bones creaked beneath her skin, and the flesh around them was so thin that I imagined I could see them through the pale wrapper. As firm as her grip was, her skin was waxy and slick. It reminded me of nothing so much as candle wax, heated tallow, and when I looked into her face, I could see nothing human there. Her face looked like an exceptionally well-crafted mask, a mask made of human skin. "Come inside," she whispered, and I could see that her mask bore too much makeup. She had really caked it on, and it made her look almost clownish. Whoever had applied it roughly. Her eyes were like black pits beneath all that dark eyeshadow. I whispered, my tongue now dry as it battered against my chapped lips. "I just need to tell my dad where
Your father can't help you now,"
she breathed, grinning with her mouth full of gravestone teeth.
"Don't worry. You'll see him very soon."
She yanked my arm then, and I saw my one chance to escape. I pulled back hard, nearly toppling her from the porch, my arm slipping out of her greasy grip. I was running flat out as she cawed angrily behind me. I didn't stop running until I reached my house. My mom was waiting for me on the porch, looking angry as I came running up. She asked what I thought I was doing out so late. She asked if I meant to meet Soap Sally, as she always joked about. She asked me if I intended to freeze to death out in the snow. All those questions went unanswered. All her anger disappeared as I wrapped my arms around her and told her that some old lady had taken Terrell and Rob. She called the police, but seemed angry when she hung up. She told me that they must have thought she was someone pulling a prank. They told her that they would get right on that, and the next time Soap Sally came after her to make sure there was less than a foot of snow on the ground. She sent me to bed, but my dreams were full of the old woman and her deep, pitiless eyes. In my dreams, she got me. In my dreams, she cackled as she peeled my skin. I woke up the next day to hear Mom on the phone with Terrell's mom. "He came home in a state last night. Said some lady had Terrell, just like I told you last night. Didn't you find anything? I'll ask him once he gets up. If he comes home, let me know, please." She hung up the phone and came to talk to me. The police came by later that day to question me. I guess they were taking the disappearance of 2 children a little more seriously now. I told them exactly what I had told my mom. Rob had hit his head, and the old lady had offered to help us. We put him in the cart and pushed him to her house. I got spooked and tried to run, but she grabbed me. I got free and ran to the house. I told my mom what had happened, and she called the police, but they didn't believe her. It seemed like they were interested in this house now and asked me to take them there. I gave them directions, but I refused to go anywhere near that place. They came back later and told me that the house appeared to have been abandoned for years and asked me if I was sure. I told them I was, and they said all they had found was a bit of dried blood and a black dress that might fit a horse. They didn't believe me, that much was apparent, but they believed me after the soap arrived. I woke up one morning about a week after Rob and Terrell disappeared and walked downstairs to the smell of breakfast. Mom was making flapjacks and bacon, and the smell turned my stomach a little as the familiar odors assaulted my nose. To this day, the smell of hot fat makes me want to puke, and the smell of it always takes me back to that house and that day. "Sweetie, could you bring the milk in off the front porch?" I looked outside. "Snow's 3 feet deep, Mom. I doubt the milkman ran today." "Well, I heard someone on the porch a few minutes ago. They left something and didn't knock. See if it's the milk before it freezes, please." Sitting on the mat was a small wicker basket. Sitting on a bed of black cloth were square packages wrapped in wax paper. I felt my breath hitch as I saw the cloth, but tried to shake it off. What didn't remind me of the old woman in the woods these days? I reached down to pick up the package and felt the semi-solid brick of soap as it smooshed a little between my fingers. I unwrapped it, not sure who would leave soap on the doorstep, and that's when I saw the note. It was under the soap, written in a long, spidery hand, and the words sent a shudder through me that the winter chill couldn't top. "See you soon." I felt the soap slip from my numb fingers. When it hit the boards, I looked down and saw something that pushed a scream up my throat. It was a bone. A finger bone. The police told my dad that it was Rob's finger bone, but they found trace evidence of Terrell's bones in the other bar of soap. Both their parents had received similar baskets of soap, and, unfortunately, Rob's grandmother had brought it out of the bathroom when the police came to check. She had been washing her hands with it all day, having no clue that she was washing her hands with her grandson's body. My own grandmother came to visit a few days later. She and Mom had a long talk about something, and I got the feeling that Mom didn't want her to tell me something. As she shuffled to my room, I couldn't help but shudder as I imagined my door opening to reveal a huge woman in a black dress and a shawl leering at me as she smiled with her witch's grin. When Grandma knocked, I told her to come in. She sat down on the bed and seemed to think about what she meant to say. "I grew up in this town, too. You know that. One night, my friend Grace and I were late coming home from a church dance. We cut through the park, and as we passed by the sign that said, 'Welcome to Basker's Park,' we saw an old woman who was trying to fix her cart. She asked us to help her get the cart to her house, and we obliged. No sooner had I seen her house, though, than I got a tickling feeling. My mother had told me about Soap Sally, too, and I suddenly realized what the smell was around that cart. It was tallow and lye and blood. I ran as quick as I could, and I never saw my friend again. You got real lucky, kiddo, but don't press your luck by being careless," she said, giving me a little hug as her bones creaked in that way that Soap Sally's had. She left me then, and we never spoke about it again. That was 5 years ago. 5 long winters ago. The snow is back, and the days are short, but I haven't left my house after dark, not since that night I lost my best friends. Though I never saw her again, I know she has seen me. Sometimes I hear the grumble of that cart, the tinkle of the bell, and it sends me running home as surely as it did the night I escaped her. My greatest fear is that she will make good on her threat one day. One day, Soap Sally may leave me on my parents' front porch, their missing son unknowingly come home.